In the earliest years of the 20th century, the great powers of Europe existed in a state of anxious calm, like a room full of antique furniture soaked in gasoline, simply waiting for a spark. On the surface, the continent seemed to be at the peak of civilization. This era, which we often look back on with a sense of gilded nostalgia, was a time of incredible technological progress, grand art, and magnificent architecture. Aristocrats still held garden parties on sprawling estates, and the Industrial Revolution had created a world of new possibilities. But beneath this polished exterior, the political ground was dangerously unstable. To an ordinary person living in London, Paris, or Berlin, the idea of a global war seemed almost impossible, a relic of a bygone century. Yet, diplomats and generals knew better. They were secretly drafting plans, forming alliances, and watching their neighbors with deep suspicion. The peace that held the continent together was not a result of friendship, but of a delicate balance of power. It was a system where no single nation was supposed to be strong enough to dominate all the others. However, this balance was shifting. A new, ambitious player had entered the game and was loudly demanding a seat at the head of the table. This tension, this strange mixture of progress and paranoia, created a pressure cooker environment. No one wanted a war, but everyone was terrified of losing their status if one started. The stage was being set for a tragedy, built not on hatred between common people, but on the fears, ambitions, and rigid military timelines of the ruling classes. To truly grasp why the world collapsed into chaos, you need to understand the complex network of promises that tied Europe together, a system designed to prevent war that ultimately made it inevitable. The logic seemed sound at the time. If two countries formed a pact to defend each other, an enemy would be less likely to attack them. This defensive reasoning created two massive, opposing blocs. On one side stood the Triple Entente, a friendly understanding between France, Russia, and Great Britain. France was desperate for security and financially supported Russia, while Britain, an island nation with the world's largest navy, had finally looked across the water and decided it needed friends to counter growing German naval power. Opposing them was the Triple Alliance, dominated by Germany and Austria-Hungary, and loosely tied to Italy. Germany, a young and powerful nation forged only a few decades earlier, felt encircled by these partners. Its leadership believed that Russia to the east and France to the west were squeezing them into a corner. The critical danger of this system was its automatic nature. These weren't just casual agreements, they were binding military contracts that set strict mobilization schedules. If one nation pulled the trigger, the others were obligated to jump in, turning a local dispute into a continental war overnight. The alliances were so secret and so rigid that they left no room for diplomacy when panic set in. A chain of steel had been wrapped around Europe, and once the first link was pulled tight, no one had the strength or the will to stop it from dragging the entire continent into the abyss. As the diplomatic wires grew tighter, a dangerous cultural shift was taking over the halls of power across Europe, a phenomenon historians call militarism. This was more than just having an army, it was the belief that military might was the supreme measure of a nation's health and that solving problems through diplomacy was a sign of weakness. Generals and admirals were treated as national heroes, and their opinions began to outweigh those of civilian politicians. In Germany, the army held an almost mystical status, a sacred institution that had forged the country through blood and iron. The Kaiser, a man who loved to dress in military uniforms and play the role of supreme warlord, surrounded himself with generals who constantly advised him that war was not a matter of if, but when. This mindset triggered a terrifying arms race. Across the sea, Great Britain watched nervously as Germany began constructing a massive, high-seas fleet. The British responded with a policy stating their navy must remain larger than the next two navies combined. Not to be outdone, the land armies of France and Russia swelled into millions of conscripted men, while the arms factories worked overtime to produce deadlier artillery shells and machine guns. Every nation had a meticulously crafted war plan. The German Schlieffen Plan was the most famous, a timetable so precise that once the order was given, it was almost impossible to stop the march of soldiers without creating logistical chaos. Military planners had built a machine designed for war, and when the political crisis finally came, the generals simply took over, arguing that the trains could not be delayed. While the soldiers drilled at home, the gaze of Europe was fixed firmly on the map of the world, in a desperate scramble known as imperialism. By the early 1900s, much of the globe had been carved up by the European powers. Great Britain boasted of an empire where the sun never set, and France controlled vast stretches of Africa and Southeast Asia. These colonies provided the raw materials, cheap labor, and markets that fueled the Industrial Revolution. However, when Germany finally unified and became a powerhouse, it looked around the banquet table of the world and discovered that almost all the plates had been taken. This created a burning sense of resentment in Berlin. The Germans believed that they, as the most dynamic and powerful industrial nation on the continent, deserved a place in the sun, meaning a colonial empire that matched their status. Their aggressive pursuit of overseas territory deeply frightened France and Britain. The flashpoints were not always in Europe, they often happened under the African sun. Twice, in Morocco, the German Kaiser directly challenged French claims to the territory, appearing with gunboats and fiery speeches. These Moroccan crises were intended to break the Entente apart, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating Britain and France, the saber-rattling convinced them that Germany was a rogue power that respected nothing but force. The competition for Africa and Asia soured the atmosphere entirely, turning rivals into bitter enemies. National honor became entangled with far-off jungles and deserts, making compromise impossible. The lesson the world learned was that these imperialist rivalries didn't stay overseas, they came home to poison the soil of Europe. If imperialism was the poison, then nationalism was the fuel that kept the fire roaring. Nationalism is the fierce, unshakable belief that one's own nation and cultural identity are superior to all others. In the early 20th century, this belief evolved from a love of one's country into an aggressive hatred of one's neighbors. The media of the day, the popular newspapers and pamphlets, printed lurid stories designed to make the public distrust foreigners. In Britain, there was a growing fear that German goods were flooding the market, and the slogan, "Made in Germany," was actually introduced to warn shoppers off what were seen as inferior products. Across the water, German nationalists preached that their culture was under threat from Slavic barbarism to the east and French decadence to the west. But the most volatile expression of nationalism was not in the major capitals, it was in a troubled region known as the Balkans, specifically within the crumbling empire of Austria-Hungary. This empire was a patchwork quilt of a dozen different ethnic groups, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and Slavs, all ruled by an aging emperor in Vienna. Many of these groups, particularly the southern Slavs, wanted independence. They looked across their border to the small, fiercely independent kingdom of Serbia as a beacon of hope. Serbia dreamed of uniting all Slavic peoples into a single, Greater Serbia. This Slavic nationalism was a direct, existential threat to the survival of the Austrian Empire. Vienna believed that if Serbia was not crushed, the empire would disintegrate. It was this specific, intense hatred between Austrian imperial pride and Serbian nationalist passion that would supply the spark. The spark that finally lit the gasoline-soaked pyre of Europe was struck on a bright, sunny morning on the 28th of June, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. The occasion was a state visit by the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie. While this was a diplomatic mission, the choice of date was deeply insulting to Serbian nationalists. The 28th of June was a sacred day of mourning in Serbian history, the anniversary of a great battle, and to parade an Austrian heir through the streets on that day was seen as a deliberate provocation. A secret group of young, radicalized Bosnian Serbs, armed with bombs and pistols supplied by a shadowy organization within Serbia, lined the motorcade route. These weren't professional soldiers, they were students, burning with nationalist fire and a willingness to die for their cause. The security for the Archduke was shockingly lax. The mayor of Sarajevo had only a handful of policemen lining the streets. The motorcade of open-top cars rolled down the Appel Quay, and the first assassination attempt came quickly. One of the conspirators threw a bomb, but it bounced off the Archduke's rolled-up car roof and exploded under the car behind them, injuring several officers. Franz Ferdinand, furious and shaken, proceeded to the town hall for a scheduled reception. Logic dictated that he should immediately leave the city by the safest route. However, the Archduke, displaying a tragic sense of duty, insisted on visiting the hospital to check on the men wounded by the bomb. The drivers were not informed of the route change, and as the lead car turned into a side street, it stopped right in front of another conspirator, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. The death of the Archduke and his wife sent a shockwave through the world's monarchies, but in the weeks that followed, the real tragedy occurred not on the battlefield, but in the diplomatic halls where the lights were going out. This period, known as the July Crisis, was a masterclass in miscalculation. Austria-Hungary had been looking for an excuse to dismember Serbia, and now they had the perfect justification. However, they had a problem. Serbia was Russia's little ally, and the Russian bear was protective of its Slavic cousins. So, before acting, Austria looked to its own powerful ally, Germany. On the 5th of July, Berlin sent a message that became infamous. They gave Austria a blank check, an unconditional promise of support, no matter what Vienna decided to do against Serbia. Emboldened, the Austrians drafted an ultimatum so harsh and designed to humiliate that they hoped Serbia would reject it. The ultimatum demanded the suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda and, shockingly, that Austrian officials be allowed to enter Serbia to run the investigation and suppress subversive movements. This was a demand that stripped Serbia of its sovereignty. Miraculously, the Serbs, exhausted and terrified, agreed to almost all the terms, barring just a few small clauses. Any neutral observer would say Serbia had bowed deeply. But Austria, pushed by a desire for war, called it a denial, broke off diplomatic relations, and began shelling Belgrade. The machinery of the alliances began to crank. Russia began to mobilize its massive army to protect Serbia. This step, the mobilization, was the point of no return. Once the Russian Tsar signed the mobilization order, the fate of Europe was sealed by the rigid timetables of the military planners. In the German mindset, Russian mobilization was an existential death sentence. The German Schlieffen Plan was based on a terrifying logic: Germany could not fight a two-front war. They believed they had to knock out France quickly in the west before Russia, the slow giant, finished gathering its armies in the east. Because of this plan, German mobilization did not just mean defense, it meant an immediate invasion. The Germans issued an ultimatum to France, demanding that they hand over their border fortresses as a sign of neutrality in a coming Russo-German war. The French, deeply insulted and bound by their treaty with Russia, refused, replying that they would act according to their own interests. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, they declared war on France. But the most catastrophic domino was yet to fall. The Schlieffen Plan demanded that the German army march through the neutral, flat plains of Belgium to bypass the French fortifications. Belgium was a small country, but its existence was guaranteed by a treaty signed by Great Britain. When German boots trampled over Belgian soil on the 4th of August, the moral calculus in London shifted. It was no longer a Balkan quarrel, it was a violation of international law on the doorstep of the English Channel. Britain, led by Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, sent an ultimatum to Berlin demanding they withdraw. When the deadline passed with no reply, Britain declared war. Looking out from his office window, Grey famously remarked that the lamps were going out all over Europe, and they would not be lit again in their lifetime. As the armies mobilized, a collective madness swept through the streets of the European capitals, a psychological phenomenon that caught even hardened politicians off guard. Huge crowds gathered in public squares, singing patriotic songs and throwing flowers at marching columns of soldiers. In Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, the prevailing emotion was not fear, but an overwhelming sense of relief. The decades of tension, the naval races, the crises over Morocco, and the uncertainty were finally over. A clear, black and white narrative had emerged: we are the righteous, and we are being attacked by the villain. Young men ran to recruitment offices, terrified that the war would be over by Christmas before they could prove their manhood. This euphoria was powered by a lethal military doctrine known as the cult of the offensive. Every single great power believed that the next war would be won by the side that attacked first and with the most elan, or spirit. The French generals preached an almost mystical belief in the power of the bayonet charge, the belief that willpower could overcome bullets. The Germans put their faith in their meticulously organized railway schedules and heavy howitzers. No one paid attention to the lessons of the American Civil War or the recent Balkan conflicts, where modern rifles and machine guns had made attacking across open ground a suicidal act. Military leaders viewed the defensive as a cowardly defeat. Because everyone believed the attacker had the ultimate advantage, the pressure to mobilize first, to strike first, and to break treaties first was immense. The tragedy is that this belief was fatally wrong. The technology of defense, the barbed wire, the heavy artillery, and the machine gun, had far outpaced the technology of the human leg. So, we return to the initial question: what actually caused the war? If you strip away the timelines and the treaties, you find that the root cause was a catastrophic failure of imagination and courage among a very small group of men. The rigid alliance systems, designed to act as a deterrent, functioned instead as a suicide pact that dragged millions into a conflict they had no stake in. The arms race didn't just prepare for war, it created a paranoid culture where war was seen as inevitable. The imperial rivalries fueled a deep bitterness that made Germany feel cheated and Britain feel threatened. And finally, nationalist passion, particularly in the Balkans, provided the specific spark of Sarajevo that ignited the tinder. But ultimately, the Great War happened because the men in charge chose it. During the July crisis, the phone lines and telegraphs worked fine, the kings were writing letters to their cousins, and there was plenty of time to walk back from the brink, just as they had done during previous crises. This time, however, they lacked the political will to de-escalate. They were more afraid of looking weak than they were of losing millions of lives. As the video fades to black on the cheering crowds of August 1914, we are left with a haunting image. These men, marching with smiles and flowers on their rifles, had no idea they were walking into a mechanized horror show that would invent trench warfare, poison gas, and human suffering on an industrial scale. The causes of the First World War serve as a permanent warning from history, that national pride, rigid military dogma, and a lack of diplomatic empathy can turn a single assassination into the end of a civilization. If you found this deep dive into history insightful, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep learning from the past.